Greetings and welcome back to another discussion. I am joined today by our resident expert on all matters economic and all matters pertaining to Korean culture, Moon Hwa. Now, I want to make it a point at the beginning that a lot of people might be inclined to forget that, in fact, up until very recently, North Korea, that is the subject matter today, was featured very prominently in the news, and then it kind of got suffocated under the stuff in Charlottesville and all this other crap that's been going on, primarily online. And I think there are a couple of reasons for this. Number one, before we go into the history, I think for Westerners, North Korea is this strange place. They barely even know South Korea, but only really comes on the radar of geopolitics when some leader, whether it's the original Kim Il-sung or the current one, just does something weird that seems to affect geopolitics, and people become concerned. But I mean that's just sort of the West. But I think what people forget is that North Korea is a sort of consistent and perpetual concern for not only South Korea but Japan as well as China. In fact, I think those are probably the three countries that are most concerned about North Korea. And when it kind of flashes into the Western media and then sort of disappears, there was some talk about, well, maybe they'll have the capacity to nuke Los Angeles or something, but that doesn't seem very likely. But yeah, I mean, North Korea is a pretty important ongoing situation, if you want to call it that, in the Korean Peninsula, with regards to Japan and China. And I think the thing, before we go into the history, that we want to I'd like to stress is just how young it is. I mean, when you think about Korean history, despite all the exaggerations on the part of Koreans, it is a pretty ancient culture with various dynasties and time periods. And North Korea has only really existed since the end of World War II or thereabouts. And so we think about this, it's very strange. But before we go into that, welcome my guest. Thank you for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me.
Let us.
Great to be here.
How did we get to North Korea? Usually, the story that we're told is that we have to go back, obviously, to the Japanese colonialism. They had colonized the entire peninsula, and then when Japan lost World War II in 1945, there was I believe, an official division between Soviet-occupied North and South by the Americans.
Yeah, so I think sometimes Koreans will tell you that it's unfair that Korea was divided in the sense that, Korea is not a perpetrator. It was not an Axis power during World War II, but still got divided into a communist and a capitalist, I suppose, state. But basically what happened was Japan and the Soviet Union had sort of a peace pact. So leading up to the European section of World War II, Japan had actually fought with the Soviet Union, and they were crushed. And basically, they were crushed by the Soviet army. I think the general that they went up against
the Sino-Russian war. Yeah, sorry, the Japanese-Russian war.
Yeah. So the Japanese thought, they'd fought the Russians before, so they thought they could do it. But the Soviet Union was a totally different animal. So they got crushed by the general, the famous general who was at Stalingrad. Well, anyway, that guy he crushed the Japanese, and afterwards they signed sort of a peace treaty, and that was maintained. But at the end of the war, the Soviets started to invade Manchuria and started to come down.
Manchuria, yeah. I should correct myself that the Russo-Japanese War took place in the early 20th century, I think 1905, thereabouts.
Yeah. Yeah. So the Russo-Japanese War, it's a. I mean, if you think of Russia as a European power, I mean, some people might not think of that, but it's still a Western power versus Japan, which had only industrialized, a couple decades prior. It was really surprising that they could win. And by the 1930s, Japan thought they could do it again, but they couldn't. Anyway, so the Soviet Union was coming down at the end of World War II. They had entered the Korean Peninsula. I think the United States was more interested in occupying Japan, but they realized, they didn't want Korea to go communist, the full peninsula to go communist. So they made an arrangement with the Soviet Union for them to stop at the 38th parallel, which the Soviet Union did, and then the Americans took the south of the peninsula, and that's where we have the formal divide. Prior to that, though, during the Japanese occupation, Korea, like a lot of other countries, had a lot of socialist or communist sympathizers, as well as nationalistic sympathizers, factions as well. And they had always been in conflict. I mean, the most obvious and most largest conflict in East Asia is obviously one in China. But Korea had its own miniature version of that, even though they were occupied by Japanese. So there were two factions that were fighting for Korean independence who were interested. I mean, they didn't do much fighting, actually. It's a very minuscule force, but two forces that had participated in efforts to liberate Korea. And then when that ended, you had a situation where there's both communists and I don't know. I guess I should call it nationalist forces. There, and that was what the Soviets and the Americans used.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of related. It's interesting that it's not just obviously in North Korea, but in certainly in China and Vietnam.
Yeah.
Well, there's something about sort of communism that really easily took hold in East Asian countries, and I can't help but think that's sort of related to the very collectivist nature of these places.
Yeah, I think it made a lot of sense to the people there. I mean, they had no idea back then that communism would fail the way it did. So
yeah.
So I think it must have made sense to people there.
And I imagine it was only the explicit intervention on the part of Americans in South Korea, or the southern part of the peninsula, and then of course the fact that effectively the United States became a shepherd to Japan after they had surrendered. That it's quite, I could imagine a scenario where the entirety of Korea might have embraced communism, and even sort of Japan. If Japan has just been sort of left alone, defeated but left alone, I could see how they could maybe gravitate towards that.
Yeah, I think that. I mean, there was communist movements in Japan in the 60s, and I think up to the 70s still, right? So it definitely could have been possible, but I think what happened was once the fighting started to like low level like skirmishes started to break out. There were a sufficient number of people in Korea that were not communists and were against communism, especially the religious. I think people really didn't like communists.
Yeah.
But
so we have this partitioning effectively. And that doesn't stay very stable. Well, it doesn't stay very stable in the sense that up into, after World War II and for a few years, things are, I guess, tense, but,
Yeah. So I think back then, people really could not accept the fact that Korea would be divided, especially for the long term. They thought the Korean Peninsula should be unified. Obviously, the communists thought the entirety of the peninsula should be communist, and the nationalists thought the entirety should be nationalist or democratic, or less democratic or capitalist. So they had planned to hold joint elections, which didn't work out. And then they started to hold separate elections, so they had their separate governments being established. There were some like communist guerrillas in South Korea that got crushed, I guess, between 1945 at the end of World War II and then before the Korean War started in 1950. That happened. I think South Korea was also typically pretty aggressive. I think they wanted to unify no matter what, including by force. The United States, I think in general, not just, I mean, throughout the Korean War and after, and I would say even now, kind of views Korea as not worth it in terms of cost benefit. So I think it from an American perspective, I do think that makes sense. So what happened was the U.S. kind of withheld a lot of the equipment. They withdrew from the south of the peninsula. The U.S. Army withdrew from the south of the peninsula. They even have that famous Atchison Line, which Korea and Taiwan is kind of excluded from sort of the U.S. Sphere of influence in East Asia. So it's like Japan and Philippines are in, not Taiwan and South Korea. So I mean, that's probably, I mean, there's a dispute over how much of that contributed to the Korean War. Even if that's not a major factor, it probably played some part in it. Yeah, I think in general, I think this attitude continues to today, continues thereafter, even throughout the Korean War. So if you look at the history of the Korean War, so you start out in 1950, the June of 1950.
Yeah.
Within like a month or two, most of South Korea is kind of occupied by North Korea. You have this small perimeter in the southeast of the Korean Peninsula near the city of Busan. And then with that perimeter basically holds out, and then you have an amphibious landing back in Incheon, which is near Seoul, which lands U.S. Marines behind the North Korean army. So the North Korean army basically collapses from that point. I think 1950, so the winter of 1950 to 1951, UN meaning US basically, and then like Korean army had basically been destroyed, but they're rebuilding at this time. South Korean army. They move up to the Yalu River, so that's the border between North Korea and China. And China had actually warned the Americans that they should not cross the 38th parallel, otherwise they would join the war. MacArthur ignored this. I think he might, and he proceeded, I think it makes sense in a way for him to ignore the Chinese, because if you think about it, China wasn't what it is now back in the 1950s. They had
level of threat.
Yeah, they had they had lost to the Japanese. They had this war against the Japanese that they weren't very successful, and obviously the U.S. Army, if you think about it, it's like several levels like higher on the scale than the Japanese. So if you think about it from that perspective, there's no reason the U.S. should have been worried. But maybe they got too overconfident. What happened was the Chinese army kind of infiltrated through the mountainous area of North Korea, and a lot of the U.S. army got surrounded. So you had this large retreat back to Seoul was retaken by the communist China. You retreated all the way to Suwon, and then after that you pushed back. So that's in 1951. So from 1950 to like 1951, you had this huge back and forth.
I just want to offer a small annotation here. It's interesting that in American culture, or English-speaking world, the Korean War is actually sometimes called the Forgotten War, because it doesn't. Yeah. It did not really pierce the American consciousness the same, by any means, the same way either the World War II did, or subsequently the Vietnam War. And of course, what's interesting, it's the first war in American history that goes undeclared, and the first use by, say, Truman in this case, of a quote unquote police action, a kind of extrajudiciary military action that is not officially declared by the Congress, and it sort of begins really that chain of events of never-ending American interventionism throughout the world. But most people, it was actually a pretty horrific war. If I remember, what's the term in Korean? Dongnan, right? Dongnan. You call it like the 625, I think.
Yeah.
And so that it must like that, and I find this interesting because there's this complete difference in perception of a war that had a lot of casualties. I don't remember the total number off the top of my head, but I know if you total them all up, it goes into a few million.
Yeah.
And in the part of, say, the Koreans, who probably still remember the history, even if they're, generations further down, and people that it was just this obscure place. My father, who actually who served during the Vietnam era, he also, in addition to that, he did border patrol duty along the DMZ.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, at the time he learned a bit of Korean as well. This is in the 60s. But I think most people just, yeah, just they don't even I don't think they could place it time wise or anything like that. But I imagine in school and just sort of in Korean consciousness,
Mhm.
it's obviously of great importance in a way. Maybe in some, I'm not going to say that it's the same, but the same, maybe the same magnitude or importance as the American Civil War. I mean, how would you, since it's called the
Um,
Forgotten War in the English-speaking world, how would you
yeah.
know?
So my sense of the Civil War, I mean, it feels more cultural now. I think my understanding of
Mm,
American, I mean, what the legacy.
yeah,
I think with the Korean War, it's I think there's still people from that war still that are living.
yeah,
And then there's an issue that the war was never resolved, right? It's like if the Civil
mm,
War happened and the North never conquered the South, and the South, the Confederate States still exists, it would be a different situation, right? What we
yeah.
think of the Civil War. In the same way, North Korea still exists, so it's hard to ignore that fact. And a lot of Korean, I mean, that's why everybody has to go to the military in South Korea. That's a huge
Well, not
issue.
everybody, just the men.
Oh yeah. Okay. I mean, that's everybody, I think,
Yeah.
but essentially. But
It's funny you mention that. I
yeah.
remember when I was there, and shortly after there's no short supply of sort of Korean dramas where
Hmm.
you know the boyfriend or husband to be goes off to the military and the wife ends up or the future wife ends up dumping him for somebody else. It's
Yeah, I mean, it's actually pretty common. I mean, it happens a lot. So
yeah, because there I think what are you like as far as visitation is
yeah.
concerned,
Uh-huh.
men serving in that obligatory military, but they're only allowed to visit the family and friends with like a few times a year, right?
Yeah, I think 30. So I think it was like 30 days for in my case the 28 months that I was there. It operates a lot more like prison than it would
So you
be like
went
the
through
U.S. Army.
28 months of
Yeah.
military service.
Yeah.
How
So,
did
so
that?
now it's a much shorter. I think it's 18 months now.
Yeah.
But
How I mean was that? How was that experience? I mean, you probably didn't enjoy it, I imagine.
yeah, I think the issue is being locked up.
Yeah.
So you're cut off from the rest of society. I mean, I think in the U.S. Army it's you're much more free to
Mm.
go about visiting the city or wherever you want to go during your time. But in the Korean Army, you are really stuck in your base, and there's nothing you can do. A lot of visitations or leaves and things like that are very limited.
No.
So that's a huge difference.
Mm.
Um, so
I,
anyway, that's
yeah.
that experience actually it's pretty heavy on the Korean male psyche. The
Well, I
experience of going
imagine. I
through
remember
that. Yeah.
reading
Uh-huh.
a few years ago.
Yeah.
There was a controversy that basically men who serve in the military in South Korea should be,
Hmm.
I guess, compensated afterwards or given
Yeah.
some sort of not advantage, but some sort of opportunity because of the years that there were lost. And I
Yeah.
think there were
So
some
so
feminists in Korea complaining about it.
yeah. So what happened was so when I was around, I think we got paid $10 per month. I mean, Korea may be lower income than America, but it's not that low. So it's
Yeah,
you can't really do that much with that money for a month. So I mean, of course, you get food and stuff like that in the military, but it's the pay is very low. But I think the 90s, what happened was they used to give additional points to males who had participated in the military if they wanted to join the government for low-level
mm,
positions in the government. So a lot of these low-level government employees, it was much easier for males to enter than females. So a lot of these feminists took it up to the Supreme Court, and they ruled it unconstitutional. So that's why it disappeared, and people have been talking about it ever since. How you know, and
yeah.
men should be compensated in some way for it.
Well, absolutely. They're throwing
Yeah,
away. Or, well, I won't say that.
yeah,
They're over 2 years. Well, it's been 18 months now, but formally over
yeah,
2 years of their life, basically locked away in a semi-solitary confinement, cut
yeah,
off from the outside world. That time during that time, you cannot develop skills or learn new things. So I think there should be some kind of compensation. It's
yeah. I
basically
mean, You can, but it's very difficult in that environment. It's really difficult.
Well, right.
Yeah.
It's a hindrance. It's an
Yeah.
obstacle, and
Yeah.
so as a consequence, I think it's only reasonable to say, look, if these men are willing to serve for their country, and well, if they're willing, it's obligatory. They have to.
Yeah.
There needs to be some kind of compensation.
Hmm.
It's otherwise it's kind of a bit like slave labor. Now, here's a parallel that they eventually got rid of in Germany.
Well,
So,
let me tell you that we're
hmm,
treated like slave labor too. So
okay, so
it's
this
not like
confirms that.
we're honored. Yeah.
So a parallel in Germany was something that existed up until comparatively recently, and my recent history is always worse than my medieval history. So I think it was up until a few years ago, although the audience, if they're more keen, maybe some Germans can correct me on this, obligatory civil service and or military service. So you could choose
Hmm.
if you were a male. Well, women didn't have to do anything. A male to do civil service or military service. And I imagine in Korea, something like civil service was never an option.
You can do it if you're not physically fit for military service.
Right. Okay, so
Yeah.
that also was
Yeah.
part of the German policy.
Yeah.
What about, I mean, what about the idea of kind of civil service for women? The excuse they used in Germany was, they can get pregnant, but
Hmm.
the prime age of civil service in Germany had been, 18, 19, 20, 21.
Uh-huh.
Most sort of quote unquote upstanding women wouldn't be getting pregnant during those years, so it didn't really make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And even in a place like Israel, which has so supposed,
Hmm.
uh, you know, co co-gender military service,
Okay.
I've spoken to a number of Israelis, and the women do a fraction of what the men have to. Now,
Uh,
my position on this is pretty simple.
mhm.
You can say that, okay, well, if you want to acknowledge that men are better equipped for military service and doing these things, which I think they are, and all
Mhm.
what have you, and women aren't, that's
Mhm.
fine. But at the same, they need to receive some kind of compensation for effectively throwing away productive years of their life that could otherwise be channeled in something else, like work or learning something
Yeah.
useful. I'm not saying it's not entirely useful to learn how to fire a rifle and all these things, but if you want to get in the working world or I mean, who knows? You could have been studying econometrics during those years, right?
Yeah.
Um,
So I mean, I can actually one up you on this.
okay.
Well, the problem I have with women is that they don't serve in the draft,
Hmm.
but they get to apply for the NCOs and the officer corps. So it's a
Ah.
really garbage situation where the females can be a sergeant or an officer
Hmm.
getting paid. So basically a military career type job, but they don't have to serve in the draft. I mean, you have to make up your mind one way or another. So it's
Well, I
I
mean,
find that if it's gonna be a military male only draft, then women have no place in the military at all. They should just be kicked out.
right, and I think I mean, this is a kind of a universal thing, right?
Yeah.
Because everywhere you look across the world, doesn't matter the country or culture, any culture that's quote unquote liberated, you
Hmm.
want women, you get these women who want to get on the Gibbs train
Yeah.
without having to pay some kind of service, either time or actual work or whatever into it. And sorry, apologies to the audience. There's some car going
Hmm.
off in the background. But I mean, this just doesn't make any sense from a logical perspective. You can say I'm not going to do the service, and in return, I don't want any special benefits, right?
Hmm.
Or you can
Yeah.
say I'm going to be consigned to the military or whatever, and as a consequence of that, when I get out, I'm going to have some kind of compensation to do something.
Yeah.
So it's yeah, I think it's I mean it's an ongoing problem, obviously.
Yeah. Yeah. So well, anyway, that's the situation with the Korean Army in the
Yeah.
draft. So basically, the Korean Army, I think, if you want to look at the numbers, we have about about 600,000, slightly less than that, I think now, because the population, the fighting age population is decreasing. About slightly less than 600,000 active forces, but we also have like a gigantic reserve, army reserve. That could probably goes into like 3 or 4 million, I think. So if the size of the German army that invaded Soviet Russia in World War II was 3 million. So basically around that number.
Yeah, and I think, well, obviously, because of the shrinking population, or not shrinking, but the lack of, well, not having enough children, whatever, that's sort of a problem everywhere. That would contribute to a shrinking of the forces. Now,
anyway,
in the military, what kind of things do you hear with regards to North Korea? Is there a kind of almost politicized, sinister aspect attached to North Korea in general, or is it just sort of very practical and matter of fact, and they say, look, there's a danger, or they really try to instill a sense of overwhelming fear and sort of demonize the North Koreans?
So in the military, North Korea is pretty demonized. I think they don't even call it North Korea. I think they call it like something equivalent of a North regime. So South Korea never recognized North Korea as a country, right? So I think we'll say it's a illegitimate regime in the North. I think something Puke, that's what we say it. North. Northern regime or something like that. So it's in the military itself. It's pretty anti-North Korean. That is our main enemy, after all.
Yeah. But like I said, it's fascinating because of because historically, up until the 20th century, there was a continuity. Well, obviously there were divisions in the kingdoms, but there was a long-standing cultural continuity.
Yeah.
But the Korean War ends in 1953 in July.
Yeah. So what I just wanted to say, so after 1951, so basically the border kind of stabilizes. What happens is we have large-scale skirmishes. By large-scale skirmishes, I mean like several divisions of Chinese and North Korean armies like clashing with the American and Korean army. But really, what happens is you kind of defend the border, you advance like a couple miles, you stopped. I think the United States after 1951 was no longer willing to make any major offensive moves within North Korea. I think they were no longer, the United States they didn't want to put any more effort into this. I mean, the cost-benefit analysis, I think, never worked out for America. So I think they wanted to stop the war. I think the South Korean president at the time really wanted to continue, but
this goes hand in hand with what I said before, being the forgotten war. That I would imagine if this Korean War had continued for a prolonged period of time, eventually, with body bags being returned home, and the public would have paid more attention to it, and they would have thought, what on earth are we doing in this sort of far-flung land? It doesn't make any sense. So they're probably, I would almost assume that was one of the major reasons why the United States wanted to get out.
I think so. I think that's the correct assessment. I think it was Ridgway who was the U.S. commander at the time, and I think you correctly assessed that the Americans had no more willpower to continue this type of war. So I think he sued for peace, and that's basically what we got. And basically we have the border that we have now. So that's up to 1953. Okay, so I think if you think about the after that, so the regime in each respective state kind of stabilizes. So anyway, South Korea has its own separate history of dictatorships and coups and things like that.
Yeah, I mean that would be a great topic for a separate video. We want to focus on North Korea here.
Yeah. So what happened to North Korea was actually North Korea in terms of economy. A lot of the Japanese during the Japanese colonization, they built a lot of factories in North Korea. I think in the 1930s, the largest factory in East Asia was actually, they say it was in North Korea. It was a fertilizer factory. And Japanese wanted to use that to kind of help their Manchurian and Korean territories. And they also had a lot of arms factories there because they had the war in China, right? So it was kind of a base for that. They also had a lot of hydroelectric power plants built. So there was a lot of infrastructure within North Korea. After the Korean War, so during this stage after 1951, you had a lot of these border skirmishes, but at the same time, you had a heavy bombardment of North Korea by the U.S. And by the way, sometimes people point this out that the U.S. kind of carpet bombed North Korea, and it brought a lot of resentment that continues to this day. I would say in response to that, the Korean War, it's actually a lot more personal than just carpet bombing. So what happened? Remember, a lot of Korea switched hands a couple of times. So what happened was a lot of people in these villages, if you had people you didn't like, you would hold them in when the North Koreans took over, for example, you would report them to the communists for being like a capitalist or something like that, and they would be. If you were lucky, I think you were the only person shot. If you were unlucky, I think you and your family get shot, and anybody who tried to try to bury you afterwards would also get shot. It's kind of like this, and these were people that they know each other, right? Like village level conflicts would end up like this, and then for example, after South Koreans took over, they would report the other guys as being communists, and then they would get shot. So it's a lot more personal than just carpet bombing, and a lot of executions and purposely knowing people would get killed type of things went on at this time. So it's not. I mean, the Korean War is not just. You can't interpret this war from this modern perspective of we shouldn't have bombed Dresden or Tokyo or whatever. It was at a different period in time, and the war, because it was a civil war, it was really personal to a lot of people living there. You had a lot of civilian casualties as a result. So I think for the people who talk about this carpet bombing, that's not really the main aspect of the war. I think a lot of the North Korean elite, I think they were more heavily affected by the U.S. bombing because they kind of stayed away from all this low-level conflict. So I think they think of that as more important. I think they were more impressed by the bombing. Mao's son got killed by napalm bomb from a U.S. bomber, I think.
Yeah, I mean, once again, getting back to the point I was making before, this was not an official war. It was not undeclared. Another reason why, and it was a civil war, and it's like a neighbor getting kind of semi-reluctantly getting involved in a dispute between two neighbors. Maybe the families have a history, they don't like each other, and then they sort of get involved, and then they really kind of need to get out. It's obviously just a much more sensitive, personal issue. And once again, I think most Americans don't even know. Well, most Americans don't know anything these days, but they certainly wouldn't know even the time period of the Korean War or the events that led up to it, or the Shida Kingdom. Before. I mean that's just.
Yeah.
In fact, most Americans think that Korean, Japanese, and Chinese are all the same languages, that they all kind of interchangeable. That it's I'm curious. I don't want to go too much off topic, but have you ever, in your time spent in the United States, did you ever encounter that level of ignorance?
Oh, I think one particular level. So this was when I was in elementary school. So I went to elementary school in the United States. I think I had a friend that kept trying to argue that Korea was a jungle for some reason. I couldn't argue. I couldn't take him out of that view. So it was always a jungle for him. So it's he knew that for some reason.
Yeah. Well, but they never. You never got allegations of. Koreans are the same as Chinese or whatever.
I think nowadays people kind of know about Koreans. I think back in the 90s,
K-pop. There you go.
Yeah.
Thank
a lot of people knew. So it was basically, I was like Chinese, like every other guy. So it's didn't really matter.
Yeah, it is funny how the current culture of K-pop and K-drama and whatever.
Yeah.
I have to admit, I actually watched the entirety of the Empress Key.
Oh,
Yeah,
you watched
I
that?
committed sin. I
Yeah.
actually enjoyed it. I think it was a well
Oh, really?
done
You know,
historiodrama doctory, or what we want to call it. But
it's
yeah,
actually, the real history behind that is actually partially true.
well, it's always
Uh,
partially true, but
yeah, in the sense that there was this Korean empress who had a huge role in kind of the downfall of the Yuan dynasty. Um,
yeah, yeah. But I
but
thought
she wasn't.
it was
Yeah, yeah,
interesting in any event.
yeah, yeah,
But that sort
yeah.
of
It's
thing obviously helps to perpetuate, quote unquote Korean culture. And
uh
now, then, we were just before the official talk started, we were talking about sort of esports and
yeah.
Korean dominance, South Korean dominance, particularly in Overwatch. And so I think everybody knows now.
Hmm.
Uh, well, I don't know. I'd imagine they might know the existence of Korea, but I don't. They probably couldn't distinguish sort of the fine differences between, and
Hmm.
not so fine differences between Japanese, Korean, and Chinese.
Yeah.
But yeah, yeah.
I mean, I would say though we're still a part of Chinese civilization, but it's just there's some differences in terms of languages and
Oh well, yeah. I mean,
things like yeah,
without a
yeah,
doubt,
yeah,
Hanja. I mean, I'm
yeah.
told I'm not exactly current on my Korean. I'm told
Hmm.
if you look at sort of heavy-duty scientific journals in Korean, you still will see and have to write Hanja. By the way, those are Chinese characters as
Yeah.
opposed to Hangul. But
So,
uh,
so the journals that I've looked at, so in the past, if you see like an academic journal, you'd see a lot of words written in Chinese.
hmm,
Now, I think what I see is a lot of words written in English. So
right,
just they
right.
do, they use English words
Have
now.
I heard
I
rumors
think,
that you had
yeah.
in high school back in the day, if you were a
Uh-huh.
Korean student,
Hmm.
you would have to learn a minimum, I think, of 1,200 maybe or 1,100 Hanja.
So that policy is time varying. So it
Okay.
depends. So in middle school, I had to learn a lot of Chinese characters.
Hmm.
In high school, the times had changed, so that requirement disappeared. I think it might have been back. I don't know what it is now, but it changes,
I'm just
changes with
wondering
the.
with the importance of the quote unquote Chinese economy and sort of it just being such a big player in East
Yeah.
Asia, if there's sort of been a resurgence. Although the confusing thing, of course, is that
Hmm.
if you look at, I mean, I don't want to go too off topic. I did study Chinese characters a little bit on my own.
Hmm.
All there's so many differences. So, for example, the Japanese who still use, the kanji, the hanja on their own, went
Yeah.
their own route. Some
Uh-huh.
characters remained the same, some changed, some became more complicated.
Hmm.
Then you have places like Taiwan, which use traditional Chinese characters,
Yeah.
um, and the list just goes on and on. So, and I would imagine the curriculum in Korea, as I recall, would be more traditional. It wouldn't be simplified Chinese characters you're learning. It's sort of a
No,
almost
no
historical.
simplified.
Yeah.
Yeah, no simplified unless you're learning Chinese, and then you learn simplified Chinese
Yeah,
characters.
yeah. So
Um,
that's the thing is that I don't really see how that would necessarily help in.
uh-huh. I think
Uh,
I think a lot of people view the simplified Chinese as being aesthetically inferior to the traditional Chinese.
well, I would actually would agree with that in my
Yeah,
experience.
yeah,
I mean, I studied the Chinese characters when I was in South Korea, just kind of a
uh-huh.
minor hobby thing.
Yeah,
And I just looked at the difference,
mhm.
and one that always sticks in. I would recognize that I probably can create it is the one for Young Dragon.
Yeah,
The difference between simplified Young Dragon and
mhm.
traditional, it looks so much nicer in traditional style. But on the
Yeah,
other hand, it's obviously a big burden for the brain and just doing all of these things. I
yeah.
think, yeah. Anyway, we went off a
Okay.
bit of topic there.
All
Interesting
right,
topic. But although
all right.
in the context of North Korea, I
Mhm.
understand based on the history I've read that
Mhm.
they had completely purged all non-Korean elements supposedly.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Even a lot of these Chinese characters they got rid of much
yeah,
earlier
yeah,
than we did.
exactly, because
Yeah.
they wanted a kind of
Uh-huh.
purely. Uh,
Yeah. So I think if you look at North Korean history, so North Korean history, I mean, due to the nature of North Korea, it's hard to get information on what actually happened. But after the Korean War, they had a very rapid reconstruction period in which a lot of the infrastructure that was destroyed was quickly rebuilt. And a
Yeah.
lot of people say, at least up to the 1960s, North Korea was still richer than South Korea
Mm.
economically at a GDP per capita level. I think one advantage people point out that North Korea, Kim Il-sung, so this is the first Kim. So we have three Kims. The first
Kim
Kim,
Il-sung,
the
the great
second
leader who
Kim,
founded the nation.
and then the third Kim, who's the young guy who's in charge now. He's number three. Anyway, the first Kim, I think what people say is he played the Soviet Union and China off of each other, so that he could get the maximum amount of support from both two. I think he got a lot of technological and knowledge type of support from the Soviet Union. He had, and then he had a lot of like a food imports and things like that from China. So apparently they were better off than South Korea until up to the 1960s. I think you can argue, like, does it go up to the 1970s or does it stop in the 1960s? So South Korea kind of catches up to North Korea in the 1960s and 70s. But just with looking within North Korea, I think people say still wasn't that bad in terms of living conditions. So I think this it's hard to say, but it must have been a situation where the communist regime hasn't collapsed yet. So this is like so after 1950, the whole country kind of has to rebuild itself, and afterwards, it's you go this downhill path. And then I think in 1966, so that's when the Chinese, I think that's 1966, right? Cultural Revolution.
Yeah.
So that's when it happens. I think the first Kim, I don't think he fully agreed with the Cultural Revolution, and I think that's around the time he goes into this something called Juche Sasang. It's this North Korean ideology. It's a weird combination of communism and Confucianism
Yeah.
and Christianity, actually. So actually, the first Kim's family, if you look into the history, first Kim's family, his family was heavily Christian. So if you think about Stalin's background, right? So Stalin also has sort of a Christian background. This first Kim also had a Christian background. And if you look at the history of Korea, actually, the northern part of Korea was more Christian than the southern part.
Interesting.
And he had this Christian background as well. Of course, when he became atheist after becoming a communist. But I think he carried on a lot of the aspects. I think I heard that they have something equivalent to the Ten Commandments. And then apparently there's like a communist afterlife. I'm not exactly sure about this, but something like that. So it's a communist Confucius in the sense that it's a patriarchy. So usually when you think about like Marxism and neo-Marxism, you think about like this feminist garbage. That's not the case in North Korea. It's a patriarchal communist sort of vaguely Christian type of political ideology. That's why a lot of people call it a religion instead of a political ideology. So you could have an argument.
Well, yeah, there's always a lot of crossover, and I should point
Yeah.
out that, it seems often the case that the son and the grandson are much less effective and I guess just much worse at getting things done. I mean, Kim Il-sung got stuff done, and then the son, Kim Jong-il,
Yeah.
sort of, and let's face it, the current Kim Jong-un is kind of a joke, isn't he? I mean, it's not.
Yeah, I think so. Given that if you think about the way Korean society is structured, in terms of, I mean, it literally, I mean, Confucianism is like the embodiment of patriarchy, right? So it's you have to be of a certain age to command respect, and given the fact that this guy's he's in his early 30s, and you're just not gonna, it just goes against getting respect in this society. Anyway, he certainly looks like he consolidated his power though through a lot of these executions.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah. So after 1960s, I think he continues to kind of benefit from China and Soviet Union, but I think that kind of falls off. I think in the 1970s, North Korea, from what I've heard, they separate the military economy from the civilian economy. And according to some people, this leads to the I mean, I think a lot of things will lead to a downfall of a communist economy, but apparently this is one of them. So that you have this like military, literally a military industrial complex that kind of exists on its own, and then a civilian economy on the side. Um, so that kind of happened in the 1970s, 1980s. I think I think um, so. We don't really know. I mean, the issue with a lot of this stuff is people don't really know what happened. But in the 1980s, apparently, um, problems start to emerge. The first Kim dies in 1994, and almost right after 1994, and you have to remember that in the late 80s, a lot of these communist regimes start to fall. So North Korea can no longer get support from Soviet Union, for example, and the Chinese are less willing to kind of support North Korea to the extent they have been. So after 1989, things start going downhill. So after 1994, the first Kim dies, and then immediately I think there's no longer anything left in the North Korean economy. So they go through this famine. So that's in the like
Yeah, I
90s.
remember.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think they call it the arduous march. 고난의 행군. Um, so this is the period where I think an estimation of a million of people starve to death.
Yeah.
Uh,
Now, there,
so
up until
yeah,
that, prior
yeah,
and afterwards, it's well known
mhm,
that the archenemy, South Korea, supplies a
yeah,
fair bit of food uh, and sustenance to North
yeah, yeah,
Korea.
yeah. So
Was
this
this
is this.
hmm,
Mhm.
was this
So
ongoing?
there.
So this had this food supply or this
Mhm,
ongoing supplying of food to North Korea, had
mhm.
this been a factor for decades prior to the famine and then sort of halted, or was this something they decided, oh, we're going to do after this took place?
So I think there may have been some small like transport of food, but I
Hmm.
think what the majority of it happened after the late 1990s. So basically, if you look at South Korean attitudes to North Korea, there's one type of group of people that really hate the communists.
Hmm.
Um, but on the other hand, there's like this line of people who are kind of pro-leftist. I mean, they're leftists themselves, and they really like North Korea for one reason or another. So in 1998, a guy called Kim Dae-jung, he's sort of a leader of a the he's sort of a leader that made South Korea become a democratic country, whereas it had been like a military dictatorship. Um, he becomes a president in 1998. Um, And what happens is he does something called the sunshine policy. And basically, basically the idea is like in one of those fables,
Hmm.
where the sun kind of, the wind and the sun tries to take off the guy's coat, right? And the wind is unable to do it because he tries to force the person, whereas the sun kind of, with continued generosity, will force the person to take off its coat.
Hmm.
So that's basically a version of that. And basically what he does is he introduces a policy where he gives a lot of aid to North Korea, a lot more aid. A lot. I mean, there is probably some aid that went before, but a lot more now in terms of not just food, but also money. There's also economic cooperation in the sense that there's now a tourist route. So you could take South Korean tourists to like a part of North Korea called Kumgangsan. So this is called
Oh.
Kumgang Mountain. It's supposed to be a famous mountain range in the Korean Peninsula, ranging back from the olden days. There's this tourist thing going on, and also in the city of Kaesong, they create this like light industrial complex where a lot of Korean factory owners kind of set up a light industries like textiles and things like that
Hmm.
um, there, and so that kind of generates money for the North Koreans. So there's two attitudes. So that person was empowered. The next president, Roh so this is the guy that committed suicide afterwards. He continues this policy, right? And so what were we talking about again? So I think we were talking
Well,
about South
we're
Korean
talking about the
aid. Yeah,
famine and
yeah,
the
yeah. So this
relationship
this
of
kind of
Korean food supplies. Yeah.
Yeah, so this kind of coincides, sort of coincides with that period. So basically, there was also a regime change in South Korea that was much more accommodating towards them.
Yeah, and towards the end, it's funny. I see
Yeah.
some parallels. That towards the end, well,
Uh-huh.
that the towards the end of the Soviet quote unquote empire, to my
Mm.
knowledge, the United States was actually providing funds and at least some form of monetary support existed. If only, I mean, I'm wondering if it's just this sort of thing
Hmm.
is based on this, particularly in the Korean Peninsula, that on this idea that if you don't help them out, things could potentially get really bad for South Korea.
Yeah, another situation I would say is that, well, there was the issue of North Korean nuclear development, right?
Hmm.
So if you look at the history of nuclear development in North Korea, and also, I mean, there's also a issue of development in South Korea, but that got canceled. So in North Korea, what happened was in the 1950s, the first Kim was sending students to the Soviet Union to try to learn, nuclear physics so that they can come back and make a bomb. They started building research reactors in the 60s. In the 70s, I think the first Kim had a big, like, he wanted to build nuclear electric power for electric power reactors. And then in 1980s, North Korea joins the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Hmm.
Um, but I think they never were fully inspected by the one kind of agency.
Yeah, yeah. I'm trying to
Uh,
remember the name of the agency off the top of my head. I know the I.
yeah.
Now I'm annoyed. I can't remember it. Let me. I have to Google this now. Nuclear. Yeah, let me see what it's called. International Atomic Energy Agency.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay. So they're supposed
the
to get
IN.
inspected by them,
Yeah.
I think, but I think they never fully got through it or something like that, and or they were pulling some tricks.
Hmm.
Uh, and I think they finally noticed that some of the plutonium that you're supposed to have weren't there and things like that. And in 1993, North Korea tries to withdraw, and they do a suspended withdrawal from the NPT. In 1994, there's this relatively major agreement in which the United States agrees to provide two light nuclear reactors to North Korea, and then North Korea agrees to fully disarm their nuclear program. From 1994 onwards, there's this like constant issue of delays, and then North Korea does things like missile testing and some other things like that, some missing plutonium and things like that. These things kind of happen, and at the same time, there's the issue of humanitarian aid. This is happening at the same time of this nuclear treaty. I think as part of the agreement, I think also the United States agreed to provide North Korea with fuels. I think it was diesel or something like that. And then that wasn't like an ongoing process. They continued it, and then if North Korea did something provocative, that they would discontinue and then continue later. So it was this up and down process from 1994 onwards. And then you remember that from 1998 there was also a regime change in South Korea that was really much more supportive of North Korea. These are the sort of the South Korean leftists that took power back then. So this is like from 1998 to 2008, basically during that period. Um, and then, well, remember the issue is, well, that happened throughout the 1990s, and then in 2001, well, 9/11 happened, right? So United States became heavily involved in the Middle East, and I think the United States really didn't have any more deterrence
Hmm.
with respect to North Korea anymore. I don't think it was possible for them to have any type of military reaction there anymore.
No.
I mean, especially with what was going on in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then, Bush calls North Korea an axis of evil. 2003, North Korea withdraws from the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And then in 2006, if you think about it, South Koreans, this leftist government, they're trying to do the best they can to accommodate North Korea, kind of like how Chamberlain would have done to Hitler in before World War II. But they don't really care about South Korea, right? So 2006, they do their first nuclear weapons test. The first one is 2006. The second one is 2009. Third, it goes on. I think we're up to our fifth nuclear test now, and I mean, like you said before, they now have developed their ballistic missile technology now to a sufficient extent that it's becoming a little bit more concerning for people outside of East Asia. So that's the issue. South Korea, the issue is I think the Do Myun. This is remember the guy that committed suicide.
Yeah.
There was an interesting. So I think there's this guy named Robert Gates. He's a defense secretary under President Obama, I think.
Yeah, he was. That was him.
And then apparently this South Korean president told Gates that he thought the biggest security threats to East Asia were the United States and Japan. So this is kind of the thinking behind the South Korean leaders at this time. So kind of think about how it's a little bit, it's kind of a complicated situation in that sense. So I mean, yeah, that's what happened with the nuclear development and with the aid. And I think before the 1990s, North Korea may not have really needed that much foreign aid. After the 80s, during and after the 1990s, they are kind of economically depressed. I've heard though that recently North Korea is now doing a bit better economically than they used to be.
What is the perception in South Korea? I mean, these days are for independent of what the politicians think and what happened. That I mean, it's claimed. I don't really believe this because it doesn't make sense practically. That a lot of South Koreans want a unified Korea. Now, first off, I think that's at least for the next couple of decades, that's a pipe dream. But even not being a pipe dream, I mean, it seems to me that a reunified Korea. I mean, see, for example, in Germany, well, it's been almost 30 years, and the eastern part of Germany is still more depressed economically than the West, and it has never really gained the numbers that the West had. So, and that seems like a very minimal and small problem compared to the problem of millions of undereducated, malnourished North Koreans being. I mean, effectively, I mean, it wouldn't be. It's basically like letting open the floodgates of a third world country. And I'm not saying it's identical, but it would have a major effect, obviously, on the South Korean economy.
Yeah, I think if we were to unify, I think it would be in name only. Effectively, I think labor and capital mobility would be like completely shut off, I think, at least for a couple decades, even after unification. I think unification-wise, it would only mean unification in terms of like the military and like foreign policy and things like that. But in terms of internal like movement and capital, I don't foresee. I don't think it's possible. We're going to have to do something like a Chinese two-state solution with respect to like China and Hong Kong, or what China proposes to do with China and Taiwan.
It's
something
kind
like
of,
that.
So basically, we can say that whatever joint history had existed for centuries or millennia, that given the previous 5 or 6 or so decades, that there's just no way you'll ever return to that kind of sense of a Korean cultural nation.
Yeah, I don't expect it to happen in my lifetime. I think our attitudes towards North Korea, I think a lot of the older generation are pretty anti-communist. On the younger generation, there are a lot of people who don't care, or either like are like pro North Korea almost. And I mean, there are some people who are still anti-communist, but it's not like what it was before. I mean, time has passed after that. And also, the issue with North Korea is the surrounding countries don't really want Korean unification, I think. So the United States, they don't want to be involved. I think they still don't think the cost benefit makes any sense with respect to Korean intervention. I think it's almost strange how like the United States wants to, they're pretty gung-ho when it comes to the Middle East. But when it comes to North Korea, it's they're reluctant to do anything. So it's I told you in the Korean War they didn't want to continue the war into North Korean territory after 1951. Prior to the Korean War, they didn't allow South Korea to arm itself properly, whereas the North had a huge amount of equipment from the Soviet Union. After the Korean War, even there are some examples that kind of show you the U.S. I think thinking behind it. One thing is like missile development restrictions. So the United States imposes missile restrictions in South Korea. So South Korea can't develop missiles to the extent that it wants to. So, for example, I think the missile restriction used to be limited to about like 180 kilometers. So in 1979, what the United States did was they told South Korea, well, you can't develop missiles that go beyond 180 kilometers. And the reason was that that's the range between the closest part of South Korea to Pyongyang. So Pyongyang is the capital of North Korea. So they didn't want South Korean missiles to reach Pyongyang. So that was restricted. And that way, in 1990, that restriction was even heavier now. So the warheads were now restricted to 500 kilograms. So the warheads had to be less than 500 kilograms. And the United States also restricted the development for any rockets, regardless of whether or not it's military, whether or not it's for industry or science. So you couldn't do it to launch satellites, for example. So you could only go to 180 kilometers. I think in 2001 it was a little bit reduced, so the ballistic missile range could now be 300 kilograms. Warhead with 500 warhead. I mean, the range could be 300 kilometers. Warhead could be 500 kilograms. There was sort of a trade-off, I think. The range could be 500 kilometers, but then the warhead had to be reduced to 300 kilograms. I think now I think it generally got increased. But I think the most recent one, the ballistic missile range is restricted so that it doesn't reach China. So South Korea can't reach China. So the United States doesn't want South Korea to be a problem. And then they're thinking of new negotiations now between the Trump administration and the South Korean regime that we have now. I think there's another issue. I think there's another example in 2010. So in 2010, there's the North Koreans bombarded a island off of their coast using artillery. This is in Yeonpyeong Island. And what the South Korean president at the time, he wanted, so this is in 2010, so this is not a leftist president. So he wanted to retaliate by using aircraft and artillery. But the United States thought, well, you're going too far, and kind of, by the way, the Americans still have operational control over the South Korean military, so they didn't allow that to happen. So it became kind of a...
This raises an interesting question. Is the presence, was it still 30,000 boots on the ground?
Yeah.
Numerous military bases. And every now and then there's some, small tragedy where a military vehicle hits a bunch of children or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
How much real resentment exists in the South Korean population towards the continual, military presence? I think John McCain famously said, this was in like mid-2000, 2008 during the Ron Paul election. Brown said, well, why do we still have troops in Korea? And McCain says, well, we can have them there for a century for all I care. There's a kind of, it seems to kind of rise and fall, that sort of either hostility or indifference, or what would you say the current state of affairs is with regards to that?
I think when I was in college, that was really that sentiment was there. So like you said, there were like two schoolgirls that got crushed by a U.S. tank. So that brought about a lot of resentment, and there were like small level crimes like rape and some murder and things like that committed by U.S. personnel. So there was some resentment with respect to that. But now I think the United States Army does a better job of controlling people, or maybe the U.S. military personnel feel Korea's better than Iraq, than to be stationed. Maybe, who knows? There's not that many incidents anymore, and people, I think, because China has become a lot more assertive than they used to be, and then North Korea has all these nuclear weapons that we didn't have back in the early 2000s. nobody's complaining anymore. Not that I've seen.
Right.
So it's kind of interesting how people's perception change, like
Well,
to
yeah,
suit their interest,
obviously,
right? Yeah,
pretty much.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
there must be also a local economy that's grown around these military bases, I would imagine. Um,
yeah. There are some of those, especially in the smaller cities, I think.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So I guess there will be a continual fear,
Mhm.
real justified or not, of some kind of conflict with North Korea. But here, the thing is, given the vastness and the interconnectedness of
Uh-huh.
the modern economy, I mean, this
Yeah.
is sort of right up your alley. Any kind of war for any major economic economy, if South Korea were to go to war with North Korea, I mean, it
Mhm.
would disrupt the entire economy across the globe, I would imagine.
Uh, I think so. I'm not exactly sure. I mean, unless North Korea successfully uses an atomic weapon on Seoul or any other place,
Hmm.
I'm not sure they have the capability to exert any serious damage to South Korea anymore. I mean, there's a lot of talk about this long-range artillery. Uh, in my personal opinion, I think it's a big scare tactic. I don't think it's actually that effective, if you think about it. So if you have long-range artillery that's pointed at Seoul, you can use that artillery and you can try to knock out South Korean military facilities, or you can just bomb Seoul.
Hmm.
If you choose to just bomb Seoul, you're going to get taken out pretty quickly, and there's only a limited amount of time. I mean, the United States has like an incredible amount of firepower, right? And they do have a lot of people around Korea, and they can take in bombers and stuff like that from Guam in Japan um, to take out almost anything that North Korea has. I mean, any of this artillery that they have, regardless of how well they hit it in the mountains.
Hmm.
And the South Korean army also, it's we also have a lot of artillery on our own. We do. I mean, not as much as not of course not as much as the Americans. We have our own love for firepower.
Yeah.
So I mean, once they start to bomb Seoul, I mean they're gonna get taken out pretty quickly. I don't think they're gonna be able to do any sustained damage.
Well, there
I
was
mean,
a whole
they're yeah,
there
yeah.
was a whole discussion by Sam Harris with I forgot his name, some reporter who had spent some time investigating that sort of
Yeah.
every scenario of a war between North and South Korea is just sort of bleak and bad, and there's no solution to that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So the best case scenario, and here's the thing, it seems to me that with regards to North Korea, it's not all that dissimilar from the Iraq situation. It would have been, I mean, who knows? People obviously disagree, but I think it was a mistake to get involved in Iraq.
Yeah.
But I think the powers that be in the United States are doing the right thing because the best case scenario is a kind of a continuation of the status quo,
Yeah.
not to create this sort of spiral of chaos that led, incidentally, in part to the creation of things like ISIS. And I
Mhm.
mean, unintended
So
consequences are a huge deal, I think.
So I think in the case of North Korea, I don't see much room for ISIS. I think the only
No,
problem
no,
that
no.
I can see,
Don't
yeah,
misread me. I'm not saying
no,
ISIS will
yeah,
spring forth. My point is
no,
that
no,
there are
yeah, yeah,
unintended consequences to those types of interventions.
yeah, yeah. So I mean, there are some issues with respect to, I mean, if North Korea successfully uses a nuclear weapon, then of course, it's going to be tragic.
Yeah.
With respect to any type of traditional war, you're talking about an army that's like 3.5 million at least strong that's going to
Hmm.
invade North Korea. So it's not exactly like Iraq in the sense that there's going to be a ton of boots on the ground.
Yeah.
Um, so it's not. I mean, people are going to be able to take care of like all these smaller insurgencies or anything like that would happen. But of course, there's also the possibility of any unintended consequences. You don't know what China's going to do, and that's a huge factor. I think I think the U.S. interest is to keep the status quo, and any change from the status quo just doesn't make any sense economically. I think my opinion of what China is thinking is that they have Taiwan, and they want to maintain North Korea as sort of a leverage for Taiwan. So if anything related to Taiwan happens, they want that North Korean option. to go off at the same time. So I think strategically, China wants North Korea to exist at least for the time being.
Yeah.
Um,
And South Korea wants it
one,
to exist because of, well, we just discussed that it would be
yeah,
at the very least humanitarian, but also an economic disaster.
yeah, yeah,
United States obviously doesn't want that level of instability in the region.
yeah.
I mean, it's in everyone's interest to sort of maintain and, if need be, help fund the continuation and
hmm
perpetuation of the so-called supreme state of North Korea.
Yeah, I guess one concern is from a South Korean and Japanese perspective. You're going to be less and less sure of the American nuclear umbrella.
Hmm.
Once North Korea has nuclear missiles that can reach anywhere in the United States with reasonable accuracy, and they have these hydrogen bombs, then in that case, I mean, really have to think. I mean, is the U.S. really going to risk Los Angeles or New York for Seoul? I mean, it's hard to think that would be the case sometimes. Um,
Well, I mean,
and for
certainly if
yeah,
Los Angeles, if that's an American soil, that there will be
yeah,
concern. But
yeah,
I don't think I should hope that U.S. leaders are not callous enough to think, well, maybe we can let Seoul go, but I don't know. I honestly don't know. It's with Donald Trump, it's really hard to tell. The guy is a bit
yeah,
unpredictable.
yeah. So I mean, so Donald Trump said that he might let Japan and South Korea arm nuclear weapons in retaliation. This strategy is intended to pressure China, actually,
Hmm.
not necessarily North Korea.
Yeah.
So because North Korea's economy kind of depends on China in so many ways, and China sort of sustains it. From the South Korean perspective, I think the South Koreans are divided in the sense that I don't think we're going to be able to make up our minds whether or not we're going to develop nuclear weapons on our own. But I think if Japan does it, we're definitely going to do it. So I think it effectively probably that nuclear armament decision is going to be left to Japan at the end of the day.
Yeah. Interesting.
But and if that happens, I mean, does the NPT nuclear non-proliferation treaty does that mean anything anymore?
Well, we could
That's a
be.
whole new set of problems. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. I mean, let's face it. I'm not sure how much. I mean, the whole idea of MAD, mutually assured
yeah,
destruction. It seems that these days we have a lot of non-state actors.
yeah.
There's just kind of a chaos that didn't exist during the Cold War. The Cold War was a very stable period. I mean, despite the propaganda and the level of threat and security, well,
Mhm.
it followed a pattern. People understood it.
Yeah.
These days, it's just anything can go. I mean, there's no hard rule that says a small nuclear weapon
Mhm.
couldn't go off in a European city
Yeah.
by the hand of ISIS, for example, or some Muslim organization. Who knows? It could
Yeah.
happen. I mean, it's unlikely, but it could happen. Um,
Yeah.
and so, you know, I don't think very much means anything anymore. I mean, NATO doesn't mean a whole lot. Nothing really means anything
Yeah.
in the political scene
Yeah.
because so much of it was built upon a view of the world that was predicated on a very fixed state of sort of East versus West in the sense of, communism versus democratic capitalism or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think that Western intellectuals in particular still have not recovered in terms of their policies and worldview, although I'd argue that Donald Trump doesn't have any intellectual position. I don't really think he's aware of these things.
Yeah.
Um, Still have not recovered from the end of the communist era. They still, a lot of the people that form, even today, inform the policies of the United States and the West are kind of throwbacks to that time, which is still sort of view the world from this vantage point of communism and I mean it's not a very useful point of view anymore, or not as useful as it
Yeah.
used to be. And
Yeah.
so I think a lot of these treaties, whether it's the non-proliferation treaty
Mhm.
or I'm trying to think of something else that comes to mind. Well, the business that went on with Ukraine and Russia
Yeah.
not too
Yeah.
long ago, it, nobody really cares. We're kind of in the era of chaos. It's kind of a controlled chaos rather than uh, a predictable
Uh-huh.
set of routines, political routines
Yeah.
that people engage in. That's my feeling and sense of things,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
anything could potentially happen. I mean, we could wake up tomorrow and then read I don't know, a story in an online article about how a quarter of Amsterdam is leveled with with a nuclear device going on. Who knows? It's possible.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So,
I mean, yeah, especially with actors like North Korea. This East Asian situation is still kind of a very Cold War type situation.
yeah, and in that sense, much more
Yeah.
stable than the Western situation with the Middle East.
Yeah, you just can't predict anything with non-state actors. It's a new world.
Well,
Uh,
and that's the thing, and I
yeah,
think
yeah,
or politicians are still trying to catch up on that. And
mhm,
in fact, I think they've given up. It's the general policy in Europe is one that, well, bombs and attacks are just kind of a part of daily life on some level, so I just accept it. It
yeah,
hadn't been for, well, the entirety of centuries prior to that,
mm,
but things do change, and I'm just wondering, yeah, who knows what's going to happen next? But I think, ironically,
yeah,
given that sort of almost 20th century state of affairs
mm,
in East Asia, you're probably much safer there than people living in Europe or possibly even North America.
or maybe we've gotten used to it now in the sense that we're just South Koreans don't typically respond to North Korean provocations anymore.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
maybe I don't know if you can ever not respond to people getting crushed by trucks, but we'll see.
yeah. It's one of those
Yeah,
strange situations. But that was
yeah,
quite informative. I think we're
yeah.
going to have Joe on maybe for an introduction and course on the history of democratic dictatorship, or
Oh
the
yeah. Well,
dictatorship and democracy
or
in South
Korean
Korea.
democracy, so it was called
Yeah,
back then.
well, which
Yeah.
is for the audience a pretty recent thing. It didn't really
Mhm.
start until the late '80s, so. But that is a topic for another time, a discussion for another time. So I want to thank my guest once again for joining me. It's always great to have him on because he's obviously well informed and very knowledgeable about these topics. And yeah, I hope to get him on again for those of you interested in matters pertaining to Korea or economic
Well,
matters for that matter.
well, thank you for having me as always.
Well, thank you. 감사합니다.
Right.
If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.